fuels for building heat. Sorry. This one here is mostly just interested to the other scientists in the room. There's kind of been not really an assumption, but sometimes it's because ozone's really tricky to do, we tend to ignore it sometimes. But this here was really interesting to me, showing that a fair amount of benefits from this were due to reductions in ozone. And then this is the evaluation of those lives saved each year, not discounted. So at this plateau, it would be about $150 million worth of health benefits each year. So one of the things that this whole body of work thus far I think really showed to me was that this carbon fee can have really substantial co-benefits for health by reducing these carbon emissions. So again, put the policy in place, ends up reducing not just carbon but also these other air pollutants, which are good for health. These health benefits will generally tend to occur for those that live near or work near roadways, since most of the cuts would be from transportation. They'd occur basically at the same time as the emissions reductions begin. So one of the common concerns when dealing with climate change is a lot of people, feel like, oh, it's something that's going to happen like 50 years from now in like places other than the United States. So why should I be worried about it? It's because the things that are good for climate are also good for your health personally today. And just kind of finding that these health benefits can be really important for decisions about how to reduce carbon emissions. So I kind of like to think of it this way, is that we have a series of policy levers we can use to get toward the end goal of changing the energy system. We found this climate change one that's working out fairly well. We found a second one here looking at the health benefits of these air quality improvements. But one of the things I'm starting to realize and hoping to work on in the future is that the more we think about it, the more different policy levers we have that can tie into a lot of things different people care about. So if you don't care about health or climate change for some reason, maybe you care about noise and light pollution or infrastructure or jobs or mental health or acid rain or the ocean, other ecosystems, toxic metals. There's all kinds of good reasons to be doing this. Since I still have a little bit of time. And we have a fairly big history of doing this before in our group, and the sort of health argument working. So about 10 years ago, what really got me started on this was working on this paper, looking at the full cost of coal, thinking about air pollution, climate change, water pollution and community health in coal mining communities, railway accidents, all this different kind of stuff. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. But basically we found that the total impacts were about $345 billion with a B dollars every year due to coal. Mostly from climate, from air pollution, and from health impacts in Appalachia, where there's a lot of health harms due to mining practices. So similar to what I did with the renewable energy work, we put it in terms of the amount of electricity generated. And these are, what we found is for our best estimate of what the cost was, it was about 18 cents per kilowatt hour of, again, these are these external costs that the coal companies or whatever else doesn't have to pay for. So when it's in these terms, we can compare it to the actual costs. So coal costs 4 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. The external costs to everybody else are 3 to 4 times that. So you can really make an argument that if coal, which costs 4 to 5 out of the pocket, had to pay the extra 18, making it 22, 23 cents a kilowatt hour, suddenly things like wind and solar look a lot more price competitive. And the only reason why they don't is because these externalities do not have to be paid for. And speaking of externalities, this is just to show, this map might actually be unrecognizable to some people in the audience, but this is actually Texas. Each and every blue dot is an active oil or gas well. All of the black things here are active oil drilling rigs, and all of the lines are pipelines. This is a video that one of my coworkers took of up in Saskatchewan, where he was helping out with doing some air pollution monitoring around one of the oil wells in Saskatchewan. You can't hear it, but it was very loud, and it was also very hot that was probably 200 or 300 feet away. This is what Massachusetts looks like, with a fair amount of pipeline network going through particularly the eastern half. And this is what it looks like nationwide, where the blue lines are pipelines that cross state boundaries. The gray ones stay within the state. Every single one of those red boxes is a compressor station. So for those of you who don't know, there are these big stations that basically their purpose is to keep the pressure up in the pipelines, to keep the gas flowing. Usually they're either powered off of natural gas coming from the pipeline or coming from diesel, and they can be major sources of air pollution. And often, maybe they're being sited in areas where we'd be concerned about from an environmental justice standpoint. And I think looking at this is important for natural gas because right now there's this really prevalent assumption that natural gas is better than coal. This is largely because we don't have a good handle on the methane leaks, and when you burn it, it produces about half as much carbon. It also produces very little sulfur, very little particulate, and about a third of the NOx, which are the three main pollutants that we're worried about. I would say health is nowhere in this debate, and it definitely should be. And the reason for that is because it was really powerful in changing the dialogue around the Clean Power Plan, where it used to be just this kind of wonky climate thing. But once we did our research, we were able to show, this is a really big public health measure. It's 3,500 lives a year that we're saving, other hospital admissions that we're saving, heart attacks, and all these other health benefits if this plan were to stay in place. When we did it for coal, it resulted in a lot of advocacy that was really driven by health. In particular, the Sierra Club has their Beyond Coal campaign, and this is 350.org. So one of the things that we're wanting to do next now is applying the same full cost approach to the natural gas infrastructure. Every single one of these blue dots is a natural gas power plant, a storage facility, a natural gas production facility, basically a refinery, or a pipeline. So there's a lot. If anybody remembers a couple of years ago, there was a major gas leak in Southern California in Aliso Canyon. We were following that about as closely as a lot of people were following the Deepwater Horizon accident. It took 3 or 4 months for the well to be plugged and blocked and the leak fixed. About 10,000 people had to be evacuated from their homes. And we were sitting there asking ourselves, is this going to happen again? The answer is probably, because about 1 in 5 wells in the country, it's about 2,700 wells, have that same vulnerability. Most of them happen to be in Pennsylvania, Western New York, Michigan, with a few in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and of course Aliso Canyon and a few others in California. So one of the things we're hoping to do for the future, this is our drone. It is mounted with a series of air quality sensors designed for looking at air pollution from natural gas. Right now we have it more or less calibrated toward combustion and calibrated for, we're looking for probably a compressor station to fly it over for its first real live test flight. So with that was kind of a quick tour of sort of the past of co-benefits research. I gave you the present, and this here is at least where I'm thinking the future is going. So with that, I want to say thank you to everybody in the audience, and in particular all these people here who helped to fund the co-benefits work, really made it able for me to do this piece of research and get it out into the world. So with that, thank you.
And likewise, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, very much for an enlightening talk, and one which lets us connect the dots between some data and the legislation that we all want to support, which is on the back of your brochures that you'll find there.
Yeah. Do you know how well the European carbon pricing market is working, and how U.S. and they are comparing differences?
The carbon market and where?
in Europe?
Oh, in Europe. Not effective as a lot of people have hoped, mostly because the price on carbon is too low. Simple fact of the matter.
Maybe I have another question. Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So at the earlier slides, you have this a map of in the Boston area with the water on the hurricane category 3. Was that included the amount of rains you anticipate, or just mostly storm surge related?
That's just storm surge.
I see. So in case like Harvey, which actually brought so much rain, that would be, significantly higher than that.
It would
right?
be, it'd be very different. Depends on tides, and as I'm learning, many, many other things.
As we transition more and more to renewable energy, what risks are there to all the installations of wind and solar when a Category 5 hurricane comes along?
Good question. That is something that's sort of on our research wish list that we haven't been able to get to yet. But there's certainly a lot of different power plants that would be in the way of a Category anything hurricane.
As I understand it, Texas, which has quite a bit of wind turbines and wind power, the wind turbines actually fared very well, and the power plants failed. So the traditional power plants, but you may know a lot more about it specifically. That was one article that I saw. And of course, wind turbines are built to withstand high winds. So that was a test of how accurate the design was.
That reminds me of a slightly less happy story. In Florida, where there was I think it was a home for senior citizens where a good number of people died due to just heat exposure because power was out because of the hurricane. So they couldn't get to air conditioning, and they had heat stroke. Had the residents been powered by solar and had policies been in place to allow for the solar to be able to continue to provide electricity to the building in the event of a power outage in the wider grid, those deaths may have been avoidable.
I'm going to toss in one question of my own, Jonathan, and that's, would you like to speculate on a mechanism for air pollution to impact autism and Alzheimer's? And if not speculate on a mechanism, just tell us a little bit more about the connection.
The simple answer to that is inflammation. All of these different diseases, a lot of the heart attacks, certainly a lot of that is related to inflammation in the blood vessels and the whole pathway for platelet formation and physiology. Yeah, I don't need to go into a medical lecture. It's on the inflammation pathway. So is a lot of respiratory disease. So asthma is literally inflammation of the pathways, the airways. Similarly, it's looking like that is what's going on with Alzheimer's and possibly autism as well, is that there's just inflammation triggering the, in the case of autism, different sort of brain development, and in the case of Alzheimer's, the formation of the plaques.
Thank you.
And that one, I should mention that's the the autism one I think is a little bit less researched, or at least that I'm familiar with. The Alzheimer's one that was demonstrated in a cohort in Taiwan, that people who have higher air pollution exposure are at higher risk of Alzheimer's. And it was also demonstrated in rats, where they were able to sort of instigate the formation of those plaques by exposing the rats to air pollution.
Would you comment on wood burning, recreational or home heating, or in New Hampshire generating power, maybe here too?
Wood burning. A lot of things have to happen in order for it to be carbon neutral, involving very good forestry to make sure that the amount of carbon that you're burning is more than offset by the amount that the forest is saving. Wood burning, it's a very inefficient form of combustion, And it's actually, in some rural areas, one of the bigger contributors to air pollution in those regions.
Hey, are there any negative health impacts of wind farms on residents that live close to wind farms?
Depends on how close. In most cases, no, and the guidance that I'm familiar with, basically as long as you're more than a mile or two away, you shouldn't have any of these health effects. It should be out of range of flicker, should be out of range of noise, sleep disturbance, that kind of thing. There's two papers that actually showed that exposure to, it's actually kind of a funny experiment. So there's an experimental version of this where one of the main health effects people is worried about with wind is exposure to infrasound. So what they did is they split a group of people up into 4 groups. One of the groups was, 2 of the groups were exposed to infrasound, 2 of them were not. Within each of those groups, they told the person they were exposed to infrasound and it might have health effects. The other one, they didn't tell them anything. The people that had the health effects were the ones that were told they were being exposed to something that's harmful, not the people that were exposed to infrasound. So it's actually a demonstration of what's called the nocebo effect, where there's the placebo effect where I can tell you, this is, it's water, but it'll make you feel better, it's a sugar pill or whatever, or I can tell you it's a pharmaceutical when it's really not, and you take it, and you feel better even though it's cornstarch, sugar, and water. This is the opposite of that, where if I tell you something is bad for you, you then experience health effects. This was also demonstrated, I believe, in Australia, maybe Canada, I can't remember which, where rather than doing experiments, they did it observationally, where there was wind farms in an area, there were billboards that said wind farms are bad for you in an area. In some places they overlapped. Having health effects was more related to exposure to the billboards than the wind farms.
I wonder whether you've looked at nuclear power and whether that has net benefits or costs.
The short answer to that is no, and not in detail. I mean, doesn't emit carbon. There is some water pollution when you're doing the mining. But the most interesting question to me is which generation nuclear power plants you're talking about. A lot of the older ones, aren't up to what we might consider modern safety standards, what we would prefer. But there's a lot of newer ones that are under development now that may or may not have some of the same vulnerabilities that the plants that had the accidents did. And I can tell you with Fukushima, at least, one of the many things that had to go wrong was improper inspections and one of their backup generators going offline.
You're focused on essentially power generation, transportation, but I believe that they really account for about 25% of the carbon load on the atmosphere. What I'm wondering is about 75% seems to be from agriculture, from deforestation, and so forth, and the pollutants that they generate. I wondered if you had any comment on that.
On the other 75%? The idea of, at least the idea of co-benefits works everywhere, and in order to fix climate change, we have to fix all of it. If you want to flip it a different way, there are co-benefits to forest preservation in Indonesia that you could calculate based on my research on how many people died due to the fires. There's other work going on looking at the health benefits of active transportation, so that's biking and walking or doing public transportation rather than hopping into a car. Similarly, there's also been work looking at the health benefits of a more climate-friendly diet, which basically means eating lower on the food chain and generally avoiding, in particular, land-based meats, which also has health benefits just in terms of nutrition.
Just mentioned that there are people in Winchester who are working on carbon pricing issues in the state of Massachusetts and the legislation involved. And I just want people to know if they want to do something about this, there are things that we can do to be effective and work in trying to change and improve policy.
It sounds like the Obama administration relied on some of your research for the negotiations with the Paris Accords. So with Trump pulling out, can we recover, or is there a tipping point? Tipping point for what? It's just going back, I mean, I know some of the states are looking that they're organizing the East Coast and West Coast to do their part. Can we succeed without the federal government behind it? Let me put it that way.
Can we succeed without the federal government behind it? I mean, that's a tricky question. I'm kind of also depending on how it is that we approach the problem. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done now to sort of put more pressure on. So, I mean, people usually talk about California sort of leading the nation in terms of environmental policy. I've heard people from Massachusetts say that Massachusetts pokes California, and then California ends up leading the rest of the nation. I'm not qualified to get into that fight. But, I mean, that's part of the sort of design of the federal government, is that things that happen at the state level that work well might eventually get passed up to the federal level. And there are some legal mechanisms out there to sort of ensure that downwind states are protected from the actions of upwind states that I've seen starting to get used. I know Maryland in particular is suing just because they can't meet air quality regulations because there's too much coming from downwind. So there's a few different ways to sort of wrestle everybody into doing things, but I saw the carbon law thing it was a few weeks ago, and the nice thing about it is it's easy to sort of wrap your head around the simplicity of it, is that in order to be on track, this works at every single scale. Whoever we is, or you yourself, have to cut your carbon emissions every decade. So you personally have to cut your carbon emissions in half every decade. The city of Boston or the state of Massachusetts has to cut its carbon emissions in half every decade. And if the rest of the country isn't cutting their emissions in half of the rest of the decade, you can do some simple accounting to figure out how much extra work the states that are willing have to do in order to make up for the fact that the other states aren't, to get it so that the country is cutting its emissions in half every decade. It works for the rest of the world as well.
Can you describe the mechanics of how the carbon pricing would work? And as looking at myself as an individual resident, am I paying that tax? Or is someone else paying it and passing it on to me?
The mechanics of it. I mean, it depends on how the policies are written, really. But it's usually priced based on the carbon content of whatever fuel it is that you're